Hello, and thank you for joining me in this presentation, which is titled Family Influence on Young Children's Digital Readiness of Learning at Home. My name is Leigh Disney. I am an early years lecturer at Monash University, and I am presenting on behalf of my research partner, Dr. Gretchen Geng from Australian Catholic University. Before we begin, I would like to do an acknowledgement of country. So I wish to acknowledge and pay respects to the people of the Kulin Nations, the traditional owners of the lands on which we learn and in which I am speaking. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And of course, we know in the virtual world that we are currently existing in, that of us, we need to be acknowledging and aware of the traditional owners of the land and pay respects to them. And we're very fortunate to be able, in an Australian context, to be working together towards reconciliation. And it's a great journey to be on together. Okay, so the project itself was actually from my PhD from a couple of years ago, and what I was looking at was the integration of digital technology into childcare settings. And so that's sort of where the genesis of the data has come from, which I'll discuss later. What happened in 2020 made me reflect and look back at the data that I had collected during my PhD from a couple of years ago and revisit and rethink about it in a different light, because of course with COVID, we had a completely new scenario for learning, and especially in early childhood services where historically there's been a disconnect between the use of technology for learning purposes within centred delivery. And so it allowed me then to go back and look at the data from the PhD and use a different lens and use a different way of thinking about it. And so in Victoria in particular, where we had the second wave and there was such a strict lockdown, which, you know, well done Victoria, we're actually out of that now. It happened yesterday. So that's a wonderful accomplishment by the state, but it allows us to reconceptualize and rethink about the ways in which digital technology is used with prior to school age children. And so that's where the genesis of this particular presentation comes from. It's stemmed from the work I did in my PhD, but then looking at it using a different light, considering the new context in which we find ourselves within this still what we would classify, I guess, as COVID starting to become normal times, but it so within this process, it was about reimagining to the theoretical lens from which I wanted to, and my research partner Gretchen, wanted to reconsider the data that we had, I had initially collected and analysed, and then thinking about it using different, so a socioculturalist lens, and then also another theory called connectivism. And so it's imagining that, thinking of technology as something that is embedded within community practice and within family practice, and they're becoming the cultural tools of which children are forming their knowledge, and they are using these tools almost without regard to what has come before. And so now all of a sudden these cultural tools are really implemented in a way that suggests that it's going to impact how children learn and the ways in which they learn. And so for us, it was a way of revisiting that. And then connectivism is looking at addressing knowledge within the digital world, and it emphasises e-learning environments, and that often these communities are connected. And so for children, this is that process of where they start to form new connections within their worlds, because we know digital technology has the power and the capacity to do that. So the research question itself is there any correlation between young children's access to technologies at home and their levels of engagement during digital play in educational settings? And that is actually my children when they were very young, playing a game called Bugs and Buttons. And I must admit, as a parent who has knowledge within the area of digital technologies, and my children are now 12 and 8, and so to have watched them grow up with technology and to think about, especially using a sociocultural lens, to think about the ways in which technology is embedded within family practices now, is certainly an interesting exercise as an academic. And I think 2020 has brought that home even stronger for myself and for many people who work in this field. So within the PhD project itself, it was multi-layered, but the focus of today's presentation is about a parent survey to collect information, analyse the context, and then we also scales in order to measure their attitudes towards digital technology. And then also there was a component that was actual observation of children's play with digital technology. And what I did was to measure children's engagement with digital technology during play-based settings, and then, what was that level of engagement? And so then clearly we were able to compare attitudes to behaviours, which was really the focus of the work. So I had 80 participating parents. The majority of those parents were female, and the majority of those parents overall were between the ages of 31 to 40. So, within that probably older age demographic of what you want parents to be. And so when you've got 90% of, that age range, it certainly has an impact. And then the children themselves, there was a reasonable split. There were a few more males than females. And they were all within that 3 to 5 year old range. So it's looking at the period of, just before they enter school, and that sort of that couple of years of when they're starting to begin that transition process from, say, care services to then working and thinking about, how do we support children as they transition to school environments. And the last note there where it says none of the children were siblings, so consequently each of the 80 parents were different. So, there was not, a pair of twins or something like that, or an older sibling within the study. So we were able to compare attitude to children's behaviours in a quite succinct manner. So one of the first findings was that there was a great access to technology within the home. So children were able to get access to digital technology in many different forms. The majority of children were accessing touchscreen devices such as smartphones, iPads, or similar tablet devices. And, again, this data is probably a few years old now, maybe 4 or 5. It still was reflective of the fact that that particular instrument has now begun. So like it's a tool. So and we think, especially using a Vygotskian lens, about the cultural tools that children are using and are part of their regular worlds. And so in this case, we can see that the smart devices, and there's an abundance of discusses, how a touchscreen device has made such an impact on young children, because historically, say a standard laptop desktop computer within our study, it still showed that many children had access to it. But when we also looked at frequency of use, it was far less used or commonly used than, say, a smartphone. or a touchscreen device, because of the nature of the screen itself with the text, the ability of the child to use the screen in such an easy and if you go on to YouTube, you can see pictures of young babies, really already having the capacity to use touchscreen devices at such a high level, which you can debate whether that in itself is inappropriate, and to think about screen guidelines and what that actually means. And I think there's so many different factors then that go into thinking about, well, these are the tools of our children. These are now. So what does that mean? And as educators, what is our role and responsibility in thinking about how we best utilise and practice with these particular tools? So when we actually compare the attitudes of the parents compared to the children's actual use, so what we found was that the children who were really highly engaged with technology, and that the parents who allowed children to use these devices in the home, so they had access, but not all children could use, and so the ones that were able to use, they were then, okay, we can use it, and all of a sudden within their engagement, within the play phase of my study, their precision, their reaction time, satisfaction and overall ranking were much higher. So in other words, they were able to take their use at home and then translate that to an education setting where they could move on and move beyond. So there was this correlation where we could see that the children who had access at home were clearly able to better perform with the technology when they're in the education environment using educational apps. So what does this tell us? It tells us many things. We know children are having access to these tools. So the research shows, and my research has shown that, yeah, young children are having access to these devices at home, and sometimes they're using them very regularly. And so as educators, then we need to think about, the ways in which we choose to use technology within early learning services. And again, reviewing this data, thinking about 2020 context has really certainly, you have to re-envision what it means to use technology with young children, because the 2020 has shown us that as an early childhood field, we can't disregard the use and practice of digital technology. Rather, it now needs to be something where we have to engage with what it means for young children to be engaging with digital technology, and how we can best support them in order to use the technology as a learning device. And again, this means that within the home environment, we can also role model and work with parents to allow them to understand, what are the ways in which digital technology can have a positive influence on your young children, and how can you then scaffold these tools in order to maximize their benefits for the use of within those environments. Because we think about something like a concept as a digital divide, which is becoming more and more prevalent. So we understand that all of a sudden you have to go from, if a child comes to an education setting and they already have the tools, they already have the understanding how to use tools, they will then process to using those tools as learning devices. Whereas if they don't, and they have to come to an educational environment in order to learn how to use the tools, then it's going to become much harder, and consequently, it's the same transition to school. If they've got that knowledge, they can come to school and they know how to use the tools, and all of a sudden, the tools are a learning device. Whereas if they don't, then it's much harder. Okay, hopefully you got some benefit out of that, and thank you very much for listening. Really appreciate your time, and I hope you have a great conference experience. Bye.